Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of this series. In this episode, we are going to add authentication using ASP.NET Core Identity and seed the database with some roles and users so that we can log into the application. So in the previous episode, we kind of, scaffolded the application and we have a full working ASP.NET Core web application with Razor pages and ASP.NET Core Identity. But right now, there are no users, there are no roles in the database, and if we want to create a new user, as I showed you at the end of the previous episode, we can't, because when we want to create a user, because we're using like a custom type for our user, which is called application user, the database accepts to receive a full name. But the user interface of the application right now, it is not, allowing the user to enter the full name. And of course, that will change because as I have told you, even though ASP.NET Core Identity is a very good stepping stone for you to get started rapidly, you can customize the user interface, and that is something that we will do. But before we get into that stuff, I want to, in this episode, seed the database with some roles, with some, users, so that we can at least log into the system with the username and the password that we're gonna again seed to the database. I showed you in the previous episode there are no users, no roles right now. We want to change that, and of course throughout this series I am going to talk about some theoretical stuff that you need to understand. For example, roles. You need to understand what roles are and how we can assign users to different roles and how we can kind of control what users can do based on their roles. So the authorization, part of this authentication authorization course. Let's get started. So the objectives, we're going to see the database with some roles, with some users. We want to understand how ASP.NET Core Identity handles authentication. What are roles? Let's talk about roles. So as I told you, roles are like groups or labels that you can use to define what a user can do or what access a user has. So it's like authorization. So authentication is to verify the identity of the user, usually using some credentials, username and password. Authorization is to determine what the user is allowed to do, for example, with roles or claims. We will talk about claims in future episodes as well. Some roles that we can have in our application are, for example, these: admin, pilot, passenger, and crew. And we can, kind of give them access to different features of the application. We can, we can have fine-grained control of what each role can do. Why use roles? So you use roles to, of course, control access to certain pages, controllers, or actions. So to kind of limit or control the access of your users to certain features of your app. You can make authorization logic easier to understand and to implement and to maintain. Authorization means what users can do. Authentication means who are those users. And then you can reuse permissions by assigning users to roles instead of checking each user's ID or claims. So roles are like groups that you can put users into. And then you can, control access to certain features of your app based on a role or a set of roles. For example, the action methods in a controller, or some pages for that matter. How roles work in ASP.NET Core Identity? So roles are stored in these tables: ASP.NET users, ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET users, and ASP.NET user roles. So roles, ASP.NET user, ASP.NET roles, which is a table created by ASP.NET Core Identity, is the place where the roles are going to be inserted into, is that table. ASP.NET users, again, is a table where the user accounts will reside. And ASP.NET user roles, as you might have guessed, is like a join table between users and their roles. So if you want to assign, for example, a user to a specific role, you would need to create first the user, then the role, and then a record or a row inside of that ASP.NET user roles to assign a certain user to a certain role. Assign roles to users. So this is usually done during seeding or from an admin panel. You're going to use something called user manager, which we will visit if you take a look at this login partial page. So there are two things that we will see in this episode and in future episodes. You've got user manager and sign-in manager. So this user manager comes from ASP.NET Core identity, and it is bound to our application user type. And as the name suggests, so user manager is a class that will allow us to do things related to users. So as you can see here, I am using a dependency on my user manager, and I am using this method called add to role async to add a user to a certain role. So this is the way to assign a user to a role. And as I said, you can do this when you are seeding the database, or you can do this when you are creating roles. Then when you assign a user to a certain role, you can authorize, based on roles. So for example, suppose you're building like an MVC web app, there are action methods, and then you can, kind of give access to only, the users that are in a certain role. So only the users that are in admin role can kind of get to this action method. Again, you're using the authorize attribute on the action method, and you specify the role or the roles. You can separate these by comma, by the way, like here. The roles that you would want to give access to. So this is the way. I mean, you define your roles, you define your users, you assign roles to users, and then you control or limit access to different parts of your app based on their roles. Or in Razor, for example, you can do this. So if the user is in this role, this is something that you will see in our playlist, in our course. So if the user is, for example, in the admin role, go ahead and render this, anchor tag. If they're not in the admin role, of course, this will not be rendered. So let's go ahead and create a role seeder service. We want to seed the database with some roles because, as I told you, there are no users, there are no roles right now in the database. This is a class that we will create. It is called role seeder. We will create it inside a folder called services. As you can see, there are, different dependencies. So for example, I've got role manager and user manager. The user manager is bound to our custom user class, application user. Role manager is bound to the built-in class for managing roles, identity role. So like, for example, identity user, we've got identity role. And again, like identity user and the way that we can, extend identity user with a custom type, you can extend identity role with a custom type as well. If, for example, you want to store an extra piece of information about that role, you can create a custom role class, inherit from identity role, create a property in there. We're using role manager and user manager. As you can see, they are used to manage things related to users and, roles. And then we've got the constructor. We are, injecting these dependencies. And then there is this method called seed async. We are creating an array of strings for our roles. We are going to go through each role one by one. And if the role doesn't exist, we can use the existence of roles using our role manager and this method, role exists async, which of course returns true or false. If the role doesn't exist, go ahead and create that role using, again, role manager, create async, and then we will pass a new object of type identity role with the value of that role, which is a string coming from this array. And then we will, create our users. So the username or email and then the password using user manager. If the user manager cannot find, for example, that a specific user in there, in the database, again, to find a specific user, you can use find by email async. If the user cannot be found, if the user is null, it means that it is not in the database, so we can create it. How are we going to create it? By instantiating that custom class, application user, then setting username, email, full name, and email confirmed to true for now, because we do not want to send an actual email with a link to that email address. That email address, of course, doesn't exist. So email confirmed is true. So the email is confirmed already. Then we are going to use user manager with this method, create async, passing the user object that we created here, the application user object that we created here, along with the password. So admin password, which is this, which of course is not going to get stored in plain text. It is going to get hashed. And then if the result is successful, we can add that user, that only user that we created to that specific role. So we have this role and we've got this user. We're going to use add to role async, right? For that user, application user we created to that specific role. So let's go ahead and create this class. I've already created a new branch for this episode, as you can see. I'm going to create a class, a folder called services. And I am going to add a class to this. After creating the role seeder, of course, we need to call this, method in our program.cs, and I am going to tell you how to do that, so that when you run the application, the database gets the data, and you can, of course, log into the system using this email and this password. So let's go through the roles one by one. If the role doesn't exist, let's create it. Now let's create the user, admin at skyline.com and skyline at 123. Let's see if the user is already there. If it's not, let's create it using the application user type. Set email confirmed to true, and then use the user manager to create that user. And if everything succeeds, let's add that user to that role. So let's go ahead and see what else we need to do. So you can again, pause the video to study these on your own if you want. I am going to go through them anyway, but I have already explained everything. So as I said, we want to create some sample roles into the database. We will create then a user, and then we will assign that user to that role. So role manager, let's talk about this, which is bound to identity role. Let's see what this does. So this is the service that manages the roles in your ASP.NET Core identity system. You can check it to see if a role exists, or you can, for example, check it to create a role, right? So two important functionalities that we just saw. So think of it as the role database handler. Then you've got user manager bound to our custom type, application user. So this service manages user accounts. So you use it to create, users. For example, this method creates a user. Then you've got find by email async to find emails. Then you've got assign roles using add to role async. So it's the user account manager of identity. Then you've got identity role. So this is a built-in class, very similar to identity user. You've got identity role. This is a built-in class representing a role like admin or pilot. So this gets saved into the ASP.NET roles table in your database. And if you later want to extend roles with custom properties, you can exactly do what we did for application user. You can go ahead, create this class called app role, extend identity role, add your custom property. And this will result in a new field, in a new table, in a new column, right, created in this table. Of course, you need to migrate the database for that. So, but for basic usage, I guess that identity role is sufficient. How this works in the seed async, we already talked about this. We are creating an array for our roles. We are going to go through them, iterate them one at a time. And if they don't exist, if that specific role doesn't exist, we're going to create it. And then we are going to, create the, let's say, user. So if the user that we want to create doesn't exist, we want to create that user object with that, email, with that password, and then finally we add that user to that specific role. So now the tables that will get changed, of course, are ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET users, ASP.NET user roles. And let's talk about identity role a little bit, and then move on to the next part. Again, we already talked about identity user in the previous episode. Identity user is the built-in type that ASP.NET Core Identity uses to represent a user or a user account. And you can extend it. And this is what exactly what we have done exactly, right? By adding that full name property. Identity role is the same thing, but for roles. So it's a built-in type in ASP.NET Core Identity. It represents a role, different roles. You can have different roles. And it is stored in ASP.NET roles. Users are stored in ASP.NET users. So key properties, ID, name, normalized name, which is used for case insensitive lookups. If these properties are not enough for you, again, you can extend this class and add your own properties, migrate the database, and create those fields in that table. Use it when you are creating or seeding roles or defining what groups of users can do. Role manager bound to your identity role type. It's a service that helps with managing roles. So it is already there in ASP.NET Core Identity. It is in the dependency injection system. You can, inject a dependency based on role manager into your, for example, types. In this service class that we created, we are creating two dependencies on role manager and user manager, and we are expecting these dependencies in the constructor. And based on the setup that we have in our program.cs, right, based on the default identity thing that we did, we have those dependencies registered, and we can ask our DI container to kind of provide them to our, for example, role seeder class. By the way, let me go ahead and rename the file. So this is the beauty, right? By adding those services to ASP.NET Core to program.cs, you have those services registered already in your DI container. You can ask the DI container and receive them in the constructor. With role manager, there are so many different things you can do. Some of them are these. You can check the existence of a role. You can create a specific role. You can delete a role. You can find by name async, so retrieves a role by name, and you can update a role. And we will probably see some of these in action. So use it when you are creating or checking for roles dynamically, or when you want to maintain role definitions. User manager, I already talked about user manager. Your user manager, again, is a service like role manager. It is bound to your user or identity user type. In our case, we're using a custom type called application user, which inherits from identity user. What it is a service class that handles user-related operations. And in this case, it works with application user, which extends identity user. There are, again, different operations like creating, a user based on an application user, type and a password, find that user by email, add that user to a specific role, remove that from that role, is the user in that specific role, generate email confirmation token async, check password async, and so on. So use it when you want to register, authenticate, or assign roles to users, and you're building a registration system, admin dashboard, or login flow. Now, the role seeder is there. We need to run it in our program.cs. So in our program.cs, first, we need to register that as a dependency, role seeder, right? So this is going to, register your role seeder in your DI container. The lifetime is going to be a scope. So a new instance of role seeder is created per HP request or per scope if used manually, like in the next block. And then it is saved to use services like user manager, role manager, DB context inside of it, which are, of course, registered as scope services. Why it's needed? So you want to be able to, inject that role seeder later and call its seed async method to populate roles and, a default admin user. So you can, after you register that in your pipeline, you can do this. So if a scope, you are going to create this using block and then create a scope based on your services, resolve that role seeder from your, service provider, get required service, and of course you have registered that in your DI container, then you can call that seed async method. So in our, program.cs, we can, register our role seeder here. And then after we build the application, we can go ahead and create that, scope. And call that method. So let me go ahead and delete this. What this does, this creates a scope manually. If you want to know about scopes and lifetimes, I have created a playlist on those topics. You can, take a look at the channel. So this ensures you can access scoped services like role seeder, user manager, role manager, and so on, even though you're outside of a request context. So this retrieves the dependency, the role seeder dependency that we just, registered in our DI container. It gets an instance of role seeder that was registered earlier and call this method. And this method is going to populate the database. If the role and that user is not there, is going to see the database. When to run this? After you build your app. So I have already added that to the, application. Of course, one thing that we need to do now, we have added the support of roles. When we are adding, the default identity to our application, we need to add roles. Add roles with identity role. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So you see here, we are adding, add identity framework stores. Here, we need to add roles as well. So, and we are going to use identity role. So this is it. Now, the username and password is of course admin skyline.com, admin at skyline.com, and skyline at 123. Let me copy this. And of course, as I showed you in the previous episode, we need to update our login partial view to use the application user. By default, it is using the identity user, but we already did that in the previous episode. We did this, right? So we've got, the sign-in manager and user manager using application user. I already talked about user manager. So user manager is here because you want to do some operations related to users. And we will talk about sign-in manager as well. So sign-in manager, again, as the name suggests, kind of, helps you with sign-in operations. For example, as you can see here, this is just an overview. You're using sign-in manager and you're checking, is signed in? Is the user signed in? And then, if it is signed in, go ahead and render this. Otherwise, render something else, right? We will get to the sign-in manager in future episodes. We updated this, right? We have the role seeder. We have added this to our service collection here. And we are, running this when the application runs to see the database. Now, I want to show you one more time. So if I get to the table, the roles table, and the that was the table, right? I guess so. Let me take a look at the users. So view data. Right now, there are no users. There are no roles, right? But when you run the app, you will get a user here. You will get, a role here. The role is also empty. And of course, because we have assigned a user to that role, we will get a record in this table as well. ASP.NET, no, not roles claims, but ASP.NET user roles here. So all of these are empty now. But let's run the application and get back to these tables to see if the role seeder has created some sample, the only user or not. So the application is running now, but let me stop it. Let me refresh this. And as you can see, that user is added to that role. So you can see the, user ID and role ID. And if I go to the, role table, you can see that I've got 4 different roles now: crew, pilot, ground staff, and admin. And if I get to the users, again, I've got that single user created. So I've got the ID, I've got username, and so on. Password hash is there. Of course, our password is not, stored as plain text. We have the hash of our password. And now that means that the database now contains a role, a user, and we can log into the, system. So let me run this one more time. The application is here. Still, I cannot, register because the UI doesn't allow me to enter the full name of the user. That'll change, of course. Let me go to login. The username is here, and I've got the password. I think the password is what we are supposed to enter, but anyway, I am going to type it. And if I log in, let's see what happens. So let me update the password, and as you can see, it is telling me hello, and then the username, right? The email actually, hello, admin@skyline.com, and then log out. So I can log out of the system as well. So the application at least is allowing me to log into the system using that, single user that we created. We have nothing here about the role of this user, but that will of course change. And I'm going to stop the application for now. Let me go to the login partial one more time. Let me close out this one. So this is the place where that hello is rendered. As you can see here, it says if that user is signed in, render this hello and then the user identity dot name. And then it's going to, render another li element to allow you to log out of the system. Otherwise, if you're not signed in, it's going to render two li elements. So a register, li element and a login element. So this login partial is the view that is allowing you to log into the system, to log out, to register, and so on. Let me get to the notes, run and test. So we ran the application, we logged in. So what is happening under the hood when you log in? Identity authenticates the credentials. A cookie is issued to track the session, and you can later secure Razor pages or areas for that. Areas if you want with authorized attribute to add role checking. This is something that we will get to in future episodes. And that was it for this episode. Now, compared to what we did in the previous episode, we've got a role, we've got a user. That user is assigned to that role, admin. Of course, we have more than one role. And then we can at least log into the system with that username and password. But of course, we cannot register. We will change that. We will, kind of control access using roles in future episodes, and we'll have so many different, things to talk about. If you're enjoying the playlist, I'd really appreciate it to give the videos a thumbs up. And yeah, stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.